Thank you, Amanda. If you'd like to see Amanda's current work, visit the Museum of Modern Art in New York virtually, if not in person, to see the group show Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, and her participatory artwork entitled Embodied Sensations. A few years back, the Metropolitan Planning Commission estimated the cost of segregation to our region to be $4.4 billion in lost income annually. The research also concluded that if we changed the pattern of segregation, besides gaining this income, we could also see a 30% lower homicide rate and 83,000 more bachelor's degrees. Our first panel today looks at different strategies being employed now in our region to increase spatial equity. Before we begin the panel, I want to note that we have over 700 people registered for this event, which I'm very excited about. I hope you understand that while we will try to get to questions, we cannot respond to everyone. Our plan is to collect them and use them to continue the conversation. Now, to facilitate this dynamic panel and discussion, I am pleased to introduce Andrew Greenlee, Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He brings a wealth of experience and research on the question of increasing spatial equity. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Janet. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our first panel discussion for this morning, focused on the potential for increasing spatial equity. For those of us living and working in Chicago, it's readily apparent that space matters deeply within the city and region. Janet Smith's own work at the Voorhees Center reminds us that the Chicago region is divided into multiple cities, and that these, despite much progress and effort on the part of policy leaders, racial and economic segregation remain a fact of life for many within the region, and the consequences extend deeply into the lives and livelihoods of many. It's very appropriate that we're having this conversation during National Fair Housing Month and 53 years after the signing of the Fair Housing Act. However, it is also a reminder of the deep work yet to be done. Thinking about Chicago's enduring segregation, in the past, we might have explained deeply entrenched disparities as largely a function of racial animus. But the persistent nature of spatial unevenness which we see points to the ways in which Chicago, and really cities throughout the United States, are built upon structures which are designed to separate us. Our conversation today comes amidst similar national conversations, including recent announcements from the White House regarding the reintroduction of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and standards for the assessment of disparate impact. So with that as context, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce our three panelists who are going to talk more about their role in the uphill battle for spatial equity. Ciere Boatright, Amy Khare, and Alderman Robin Rue Simmons, who will be joining us by phone. As a bit of information for our guests, Alderman Simmons will also have to depart early today for another engagement, and therefore I'm going to offer her a final moment to offer a word of reflection before her leaving for that other meeting this morning. I hope you'll take a moment to read more about each of our panelists in the program, and rather than introduce them more directly, I'm going to use our first question as an opportunity for them to introduce themselves and their work. So let's turn directly to that first question. What for each of you is the significance of pursuing spatial equity through your work, and what's the type of change that you seek to make?
I can go first. So again, I'm Ciere Boatright. I'm the Vice President of Real Estate and Inclusion for Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives. CNI is a nonprofit organization, and we really focus on high impact real estate development in underserved neighborhoods. So when I think about spatial equity, I think about the work that we do, and I think about the why behind why we do it. Our work is very much place-based. We focus on the assets and communities. And so the sheer fact that we focus on underserved neighborhoods and really bring in equity in how we engage communities, engaging authentically, engaging often, partnering with community with the respective developments that come to ensure that community benefits from the developments. These are neighborhoods that have experienced decades of disinvestment. So when we think about equity, we're thinking about it in terms of housing, in terms of job creation, in terms of additional resources and amenities, in terms of support for small businesses and ensuring that they have capital to not just survive, but to thrive in the respective neighborhoods. So when we think about spatial equity, we're thinking about it from a more holistic lens, right? Not just the bricks and sticks, but how the people in those communities are impacted.
I'll jump in. Am I able to be heard okay?
You are. Thank you very much. We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is Robin Ruth Simmons, and I'm the Alderman of the 5th Ward in Evanston. And very much the same. In my role, I happen to serve our community's most disparate or disadvantaged families and neighborhoods and businesses. And in my role, I too was hoping to use equity as a tool to address our segregation, one, and our disadvantage and disinvestment that we have historically in our community due to discrimination, intentional anti-Blackness that has not been corrected yet in our public policy. So what I've done in Evanston is look to localize reparations as a way to repair the egregious acts on behalf of our city government that were outlawed in 1969 when we passed fair housing, but the consequences continue. We are looking to bridge the divide, the racial divide that we have, and allow our families that are historically Black in the West End of the 5th Ward an opportunity to enjoy the same livability, the same quality of life, the same access to housing and the marketplace and education that the rest of our friends and neighbors in Evanston enjoy. So we are continuing to do great equity work, but have identified that there is a need to expand that with repair for specific egregious acts that have been a problem in the West End of the 5th Ward, or in Evanston exactly, for many years. So we are targeting programming to correct policy from 1919 to 1969 that framed the segregation in our city, restricting the Black community to living in one area that was later disinvested in, disadvantaged, and stripped of important community amenities that have not allowed us to enjoy the same livability as our white friends and neighbors in Evanston. In our case, it's a $47,000 household income divide between Black and white Evanston. Those racial gaps continue in all areas, and we're hoping to repair that with our reparations programs.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and go next. Hi, everyone. Great to be here this morning. My name is Amy Khare. I am a researcher and research director at the National Initiative on Mixed Income Communities at Case Western Reserve University. And yet I live here in Chicago and have spent the last 15 years really trying to understand the experience of low-income communities of color, as well as mixed race and mixed income communities. I'm both a scholar and an activist. So during the last 20 years of my career in the space of housing and community development, as a white person in particular, and as a person who's had professional and educational privilege, I've definitely had the experience of crossing over, of being able to work both in low-income communities of color, but also be able to work with people in white-dominated institutions of power and privilege. And this gap between the worlds that we live in is why I am so committed to pursuing spatial equity. I think that we are facing an existential challenge in Chicago as well as in America. There's major shifts in both demographics and immigration and housing affordability, in both racial and economic inequality that really threaten to destabilize our social and political fabric and quite frankly, our democracy. So as the country is becoming more diverse, it's also becoming more polarized. And we see more and more people pulling back and pulling away from each other, as we've certainly seen in the last decade. And our cities, as well as our neighborhoods, are becoming places that are less affordable and less welcoming to people of various economic and racial and ethnic and cultural backgrounds. My work really was inspired by my brother, JT Turnball, who had a significant disability, and having the experience of living with him and understanding how important it was to live it within a community that was welcoming and that he felt a sense of belonging and connection, and also a place where he could actually get a job and earn a living wage that would allow him to afford to live in an apartment on his own. Those experiences early on really shaped, what it is that calls me to this work. And now what I wonder is, what kind of America are we creating for the future generations? In what ways can we shape a more inclusive, equitable Chicago region where neighborhoods are places where differences are affirmed and celebrated and valued, and where the zip code that you live in is not the strongest predictor of your life chances? And as someone who lives on the north side of Chicago and has experienced the multiple ways that I've had privilege because of the access that my neighborhood provides to the public school system, for my children, to neighborhood businesses that allow me to shop. I can honestly say, though, that North Side is not as good as everyone thinks. And as someone who really has been able to see and value the experience of being outside of the North Side, and really living and working in other parts of Chicago as well as other parts of the nation, I'm increasingly reminded the problem with centering whiteness and centering kind of the idea that white neighborhoods like the North Side are what we're trying to achieve within spatial equity. So I want to lay the groundwork today to really challenge us to think more constructively about the problem with whiteness and white dominated institutions and white dominated spaces. So really trying to uncover and tackle that white supremacy that many of us within this environment, even those of us like myself that are largely committed to a lifetime of inclusive, equitable community building, that still that whiteness is, that white supremacy lives within us. And so what does it take to walk the walk of an anti-racist approach to our lives and to our professional work is something I look forward to talking about today.
Indeed. Well, thank you all for those introductions. It's really inspiring to hear more about the work that each of you are doing. And I think, Amy, your last statement here really kind of leads us into the next set of questions, to think a little bit about what are some of the factors, the narratives, the conversations that are driving the type of change that each of you is making in the communities in which you work. So how is change happening in the contexts, and what's driving it right now? And let's see, maybe Ciere, would you be willing to start us off?
Of course, happily. So when I think about the change that's happening in the communities that we serve, we're seeing real change, impactful change, and I would even argue sustainable change. And to answer your first question, what's the cause for that? I think a couple things. I think strategic investment. I think our long-term approach to development. We recognize that it's not one development that's going to turn the tide on decades of disinvestment, but a long-term approach, multiple developments, a holistic approach to investment in particular. But also, when I mentioned this during my intro, authentic engagement. I can't say enough how important this piece is to me personally and professionally. Ensure that we're planning with the community, not planning for communities. These communities have been disinvested for far too long for outsiders to come in and say, hey, here's what would make this community really thrive. So really having a respectful relationship with residents and stakeholders has served us well. And this isn't a one-time thing. This isn't a, hey, let's see what the community wants because we're building a new building. This is an ongoing dialogue. This is the difference between engagement and authentic engagement. And it's getting feedback that says, well, wait, I think that's a cool idea, but I don't know that that's a priority for us. And being able to, as a developer, step back and say, that's important. Let's focus on the community's priorities and plan accordingly. So that's one thing that I would say has really ensured our success. And how does success look? Well, in Pullman, it looks different than it may look in other neighborhoods. We're seeing unemployment go down. We're seeing the property values go up. We're seeing the population stabilize. We know that on the south and west sides, we've seen departure, loss of population in Black and brown communities. We're seeing a stabilization. We're seeing more homeowners enter the neighborhood through affordable home ownership. We're seeing crime go down. And so we're seeing some pretty impressive impacts from our development over the last 10 years or so. We're talking over $450 million of investments. We're talking over 1,800 jobs. And it's really important to know that those jobs went to local residents. And we're talking residents of Pullman and Roseland. So when I speak about benefits and ensuring that the community benefits from the respective development, that's kind of how that looks on the ground and something we're really proud of. So again, strategic investment, a long-term approach, asset-based planning, and that authentic engagement, I think, are the recipes for success that we've seen in Pullman.
Absolutely. I'm going to invite Alderman Simmons to go next, also with the understanding that she's going to have to depart in just a moment. So Alderman Simmons, I invite you to respond to the question, but also to offer any additional thoughts that you wish to before you have to leave for your next engagement.
Absolutely. I've just been extended a few extra minutes for my next meeting, but I will say, just picking up there, that what's driving it is the community is driving it. Unfortunately, the community has continued to cry out on a need for opportunity and inclusion, and our data is driving it. In our city, we are declined as a Black community to 16% when we were in the mid 25% range just as early as 2010. So the community and our data, and then our values. If every year we state that our values are for inclusion and diversity, and we celebrate that, we're welcoming, and we have much ceremony that was not in line with our investments and our policy. So the change right now is happening at a policy level. I wish I could celebrate investment numbers like I just heard in Pullman and Roseland, but we don't have that yet. We have heavy investment in our downtown area and other neighborhoods that don't have a need for economic activity, an urgent need anyway. And we have long-term disinvestment in the historically Black and neighborhoods in Evanston. And so our policy is changing first. Reparations is one that I mentioned already. We have improved our inclusionary housing zoning, which will allow a mandatory unit inclusion in our planned developments that are happening rapidly in our downtown Evanston, or a significant fee in lieu, which would allow for more investment for affordable housing. We have better representation on boards, committees, and commission. We have an incoming city council that is very well representing our community, the most historically minority ever in history. So our change is happening at a policy level right now. Funding will have to follow it. And I believe that we are in a place in history now in our city, along with this nation, that there is the will to do more that is tangible and measurable, looking for outcomes that will allow us to celebrate a reduced racial gap, understanding that this is going to take years, a lifetime, multiple generations for us to address the racial divide that we have due to our history, but understanding that urgent attention is needed to policy change, and we're taking those steps in Evanston. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Alderman.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead and go next. The question again was, how is change happening in the context in which you work, and what's driving that change? So as someone who's mostly in the kind of impact research and technical assistance space, I've been able to work both locally in Chicago, but also nationally. And that perspective has really helped me to see what lies as both opportunities, but also the challenges for our region. I also was able to be part of the team of researchers and policy change agents that helped to unfold the cost of segregation project that Janet spoke about at the beginning of the call. And I think that experience it was about 100 different stakeholders across different geographies, across different professions, and across different policy sectors. So we had people that were working in the far south suburbs. We had folks who were activists in low-income communities on the south and west sides. And I think really having that level of diversity of an inclusive process is what it's going to take to get to equitable outcomes. A lot of times when we talk about equity, we only focus on equitable outcomes. So we're able to measure investment trends, or we're able to measure segregation trends. And we're able to really state, okay, there's a change over time, and in what ways. But I think for most of our research, both our local Chicago research and our national research, we know what the problems are. We've known what those problems are and those trends are for years. The problem is that we don't quite know how to intervene to address those changes. And what I would argue is the most important opportunity for all of us is to engage in the process of equity. And the process of equity, I think, is much more difficult than we've explored, both in scholarship as well as in practice. What does that look like? I think for me, it looks like first naming the many ways that I have been racist, and that I perpetuate racism in the way that I exist. It means starting from within. And I think that I'm going to just share this book, this Me and White Supremacy, a recent book that I've read that really helped me to move away from the idea of kind of white fragility, which I think is an important idea, but I don't think it goes deep enough. I don't think it helps us to tackle what's really we're holding, which is a deeper uncertainty and fear about what we as white people, or as people in positions of power and privilege, have to give up. What do we have to give up in order to get what we want? And that is a more inclusive, equitable life experience for ourselves and our children. And so I'm interested again in in the process of equity, and to get there, how micro interactions that we have with our colleagues, with our neighbors, with our friends, with young people that we know, how can those be a source of reparative healing? And then how can we use those experiences to help us have the insight and the comfort and the curiosity to engage in more ambitious cross-sector, multi-geographic efforts that really help produce macro-level systems change over time and over space. So I think without that internal journey of addressing our internalized racism, and without addressing our interpersonal racism, and without addressing the organizational racism that many of us live with every day in our workspaces and our schools and in our neighborhoods, we're not going to get to the kind of structural change that we're looking for, that we can therefore demonstrate major equity achievements in a decade or 2 decades from now. So I'm very excited and curious as to how do we promote those opportunities for calling in and calling out the times at which we all face the reality of not only racism, but other forms of internalized and systemic oppression.
Indeed, thank you all. I think this really is a perfect prompt for the next question that I'd like to pose to you, and I want to kind of lump a few things together based upon what I'm hearing. So one thing I'm interested in to get everyone's impressions on is, well, looking at this moment in 2021, what in fact does spatial equity mean or look like? So as I mentioned in my intro, in the past, we might have turned to explanations or thoughts that come to undoing legacies of racial animus. But I think we're having a very different conversation, especially in the last few years, with regards to actually what it is that we're working towards. So I'm really interested to get impressions about what does this look like, both within your local context, but then also how do we think about scaling those pursuits up and into other contexts as well? What's the potential for the type of work that you're doing to spread and to be replicated within other contexts throughout the U.S. and the world? And in fact, I'd like to yes.
I apologize. I'll jump in. I want to first lift up the cost of segregation report that was done by the Metropolitan Planning Council as an important reference that I use for the possibility of what doing our work in Evanston could establish. I believe that number was $8 billion. It was a large number, and of course, Chicago is much larger than Evanston. But I was able to use that as a reference. What we could accomplish in Evanston if we began to work on our racial disparities and our segregation, specifically relating it to that report, which was very valuable in me getting the council support that I needed to get reparations passed. But we will continue this work, and we've seen already that it is replicatable. We have been made aware of other cities and worked directly with other cities that are modeling our efforts in Evanston in their own cities. And it is something that I believe very strongly in, that policy should transition from not equity alone, but equity and repair, so that we can at least begin to reckon or make amends for the damages that have been done that continue. Generations are passing down, not having access to wealth or other traumas and other opportunity loss that is continuing a generation after generation of disparate conditions in our city. So I believe that we continue to do this work. It's not a replacement. It's not equity or repair. It is both. And it is replicatable and therefore scalable. We all know that HR 40 has been a 34-year goal in this nation, and we are likely to see a legislative action today, as a matter of fact, I believe at 3 o'clock with a markup. So yes, it is scalable. We're seeing that happen. It's certainly replicatable, and we're excited to have inspired other legislative bodies to work towards the same goal of repair.
I'd like to chime in, and I couldn't agree more with the Alderman. This is the work that we're doing, and I'll take the boots on the ground kind of approach that we're doing on the South Side. Can it be replicated? Absolutely. I'll add that it has to be a commitment, though, and it has to be a long-term commitment. It's not easy. We've seen, as both Amy and the Alderwoman so eloquently stated, the cost of segregation is not insignificant. It's huge. And so we can't just fix it overnight. We have to have long-term commitments. Private-public partnerships are absolutely necessary. We can't just look at neighborhoods and say, it's unfortunate that they look this way. But what are we going to do about it? How do we ensure that banks and other entities will pull up their sleeves sleeves and work closely with the community to really turn the tides on racism, disinvestment, strategic disinvestment, it often feels like in some neighborhoods. Yes, we've done it in Pullman. And it's interesting, a lot of people, when they talk about Pullman, they make it as if we're an anomaly, if you will. We don't have to be. It can be replicated. What do we need? That long-term approach. We need partners. We need local partners, and we need long-term financial partners that are willing to go into other neighborhoods and talk to the community and say, what do you want? How should it look? Who should build it? Where should it go? What benefits do you need to see? Right? How do we ensure that this community is a place that you're proud to live, work, and can visit, right? Others can visit. How do we really do the necessary work and do it up front so that we have a plan, we have goals, and we're kind of tracking those goals along the way. And so when we get the question of what makes Pullman so great, Pullman's a great neighborhood. It's a beautiful historic neighborhood, but there's a lot of great neighborhoods throughout the city of Chicago. There's no shortage of talent throughout our city. There's no shortage of talent throughout the South and West Side communities that are often seen as disinvested and underserved. There's been a shortage of investment, a shortage of commitment from outside partners, and a shortage of just opportunities, if you will. So I absolutely think that the work that we've done, that we've been really successful in doing, can be replicated across the city.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I do think that there's a lot of replicable models. I also think that there's a lot of political pressure that needs to be activated in order to get those models implemented. And so I first of all just want to give an important shout out to the proposed revision of the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, which Ciere and I have both been as part of the working group committee of stakeholders helping to really think through how do we create an inclusive housing policy for the city in ways that actually prioritizes racial equity and prioritizes anti-racism. It's a very complicated challenge, and as many private sector developers and investors and others know, it's extremely expensive to produce affordable housing, especially family-size units in particular parts of the city. But we've got to figure out how to address rapid redevelopment and gentrification in ways that prevent the displacement of low-income residents, and particularly residents who are living within communities of color. And so I think, that is one ordinance that is currently in front of council. And I hope that that is a debate that we will continue to have as to how do we find new policy interventions that will promote equity. I think in addition to that, there's something really struck me about my experience of working as the researcher and author on the Cost of Segregation report. And that was a comment that that a Black woman made to me about the question of segregation and why were we so focused on segregation. And I think it speaks to your question, Andrew, which is really this question of, are we trying to undo segregation by forcing integration? Or are we trying to undo segregation and more broadly undo systemic racism in our housing and community development policies by pursuing spatial equity, racial equity, and inclusion? And I think that is a much important distinction, is that there's nowhere that in our work that we should be requiring spatial integration. I think what we need to be requiring is a variety of opportunities of where people can live, thrive, work, learn, celebrate, commune. I mean, there's got to be lots of options for how we live separately and how we live inclusively. And so it's just as important to be thinking about the communities of color staying in a thriving community of color and not necessarily expecting white people or white businesses to move in to kind of create the resources or the opportunities for a healthier, more stable community. And in fact, that's what we have been doing, and that's only created more harm. So I think one thing that is really important within this space is to be very conscious of thinking about segregation at a regional level, or within the city level, but not necessarily at a micro or neighborhood level, because it could in fact be detrimental and harmful in the way that we develop communities. And then finally, I just want to also call out that one of the things that isn't happening enough is the accountability for the harm that's being created. And so we know that there are institutions of power and privilege that have financially and politically benefited from racist policies and racist practices. And what we don't yet know is, how do we engage those institutions, banks, real estate, industrialists, large corporations? How do we engage them and call them in with us in this journey so that they have some stake in helping to help listen, understand, and empathetically promote the kind of equity that we're looking for? And right now, I think we're too often looking for their money, but not necessarily looking for their hearts and minds to change. And for us to get to long-term systemic change, it's going to take more than a check. It's going to take more than a couple of seating of businesses that are run by people of color. It's going to take more than a few corporate officers that are people of color serving in those institutions. It's really got to be much more about changing the hearts and the minds, so that we can get to greater long-term change.
Indeed. Thank you all very much for those thoughts. They really speak to the complexity and the challenge of the current moment. I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions from members of the audience, and so I do encourage you to continue to contribute your questions in the chat. But I also recognize that Alderman Simmons is going to have to leave in just a moment, so I want to offer her an opportunity just to offer her final thought before we return to some of the audience questions.
Thank you, and I just want to say, Amy, thank you for lifting that up. It so often goes unacknowledged, segregation, and what are the actual goals. Using our city as an example, that desegregated schools many years ago to the disadvantage of the Black community. We closed the Black neighborhood school to diversify schools across the nation, and still today in 2021, we remain the only neighborhood in all of Evanston without a neighborhood school. So the segregation is not the primary problem. It's the intentional disinvestment of the neighborhoods of color that continue for multiple generations. And then, Ciere, just institutional partners, you're absolutely right. The city of Evanston alone, CNI, Bank, Metropolitan Planning Council, we're not alone in the responsibility in repair, redress, and equity. There are many institutional accomplices to anti-Black racism, and I would love to see more financial institutions and university systems and healthcare networks that join with tangible and very thoughtful measures and actions the work that we're doing in equity and repair. And I just wanted to leave one last thought. The stakeholder community is the priority. If they are not first at the table, we are not doing it right. And so I encourage anyone that is doing this work to lead with a strong stakeholder leadership. And lastly, I want to make sure everyone can learn more about our work in Evanston at cityofevanston.org/reparation. We have shared all of our documents, meeting minutes, resources, including the cost of segregation as an inspiration, are available on our website, and we hope that you learn more about it there. Thank you for having me, and I apologize that I have to leave early.
Alderman, thank you so much for your presence today and also for your work. It's truly inspiring to have you join us and to hear more today.
Thank you.
So I would like to make sure that we take a few moments to get into some questions from our audience. And I'd like to start with a question from Lauren. Lauren asks, each of you shared numerous ways in which change is needed and how we can do so with respect to the urgency for action. So what's the first step in your mind that we can take today in order to affect that change? And Ciere, I'd like to invite you to start, if you will.
Sure. I've got a couple examples. One, super easy. Get out of your comfort zone. Visit neighborhoods that you don't typically visit. Go support small businesses that you wouldn't otherwise. I always say there's no shortage of talent on the South and West Side. I think there's a lack of exposure to the greatness on the South and West sides of Chicago. And so get out of your comfort zone. Travel to the South and West sides, visit these neighborhoods, support the small businesses in those communities, and just educate yourselves. It's that simple. On a larger kind of what can you do, I think, one thing that has made the work that we've done in Pullman so successful is our financial partners. U.S. Bank has been an amazing financial partner over the last 10 years. And so that deep level of investment, I talk a lot about long-term commitment. They've been a long-term partner. It's helped us to be successful. So from a corporate standpoint, it's like, how can we make an impact? How do we work with communities? How do we adopt neighborhoods and not just come in and say, here's what you need, but what do you want? What do you want to see, and how can we be more supportive? So find ways to be a little more supportive, a lot more supportive. Find ways to not spread the peanut butter so thin that you're only making small impacts throughout the city. Our neighborhoods need deep investment, and we don't want you to plan for us. We want you to plan with us. And so I think just kind of thinking about the investments and thinking about the conversations in a different way, and looking at our neighborhoods in a different way, not a problem to be solved, but from an asset lens. These communities are great. We just are lacking some resources.
Mm.
Great. I'll jump in.
Absolutely. Amy, do you have? Yes.
Sure. I've just finished writing a report that I would encourage you to just check out. It's called Advancing Racial Equity in Housing and Community Development, and it's an anti-racism guide for transformative change. And so it really allowed me to think through just some simple ways for where do we get started. It's kind of a on-ramp. And I think we've got to acknowledge where we're at in our own journey. So for some of us, we're at a beginning stage, and that might be like really starting with self-reflection about how am I personally activating my commitment to anti-racism, looking at our own biases, our own implicit biases, understanding our own histories and our daily life patterns, and who we spend time with, where we spend our money, how we engage in learning about current events. Those kinds of self-reflection questions, I think, can lead us to see the ways that we are actually living in very either anti-racist and or racist ways. Secondly, I think we've got to learn how to respond when we encounter interpersonal racism and exclusion and oppression. And we have choices that we can make about asking for more information, clarifying the ideas that we have, setting boundaries of what we are willing to partake in and what we're not willing to partake in. And then there's kind of other ways, I think, that are more institutional or more kind of within your organization that can allow you to further advance your commitment. And those can be things like asking for support from leaders within your organization who have demonstrated a commitment to equity, inviting a planned discussion with people who are perpetuating racist behaviors or exclusionary behaviors, and really trying to engage in meaningful collaborations with people and with community organizations that are highlighting the valuable and possible ways for anti-Black racism and also for more liberation. And so I think those are just some ways to get started. I think, we can't ever believe that we're done, though, right? Like, these are, for those of us that are in this journey, we know it's a lifetime. We know that we will die, and our children will need to carry on the work that we're laying the seeds for now. And when I think about where we're at in 2021, it's so important to think about it historically and to realize this is a year we're all going to be looking back on, just like 1968. And just like the end of the Civil War. And we're going to be seeking for what's next. We're in that moment of the unfolding of the disruption. And that's a wonderful thing. Disruption of the systems that are perpetuating harm is exactly what we need. We need this disruption in order to build something new. And so I would really encourage us to take on the idea of reparations and of liberation, and also the ideas of abolition, of really being able to dream, of having freedom dreams, just like those who were enslaved did. They had freedom dreams of something different and new, just like we must hold as well, for dreaming of a different kind of community and a different kind of beloved community, as Congressman John Lewis talked about.
Indeed, Amy, thank you very much. Ciere, thank you very much. Very inspiring words, and I think a perfect sentiment for us to close out our time here together. So it's been my pleasure to help facilitate this incredibly inspiring conversation, and to have a moment as we end to think about the deep and challenging nature of the work that lies ahead. Amy, as you're saying, we're stepping into the shoes of forebears who fought a hard fight, and we're facing a hard fight as well. But we have the tools in front of us. We have the power of community, and we have to take advantage of this moment that we have in order to affect the type of change that we want to see in the world. So thank you all for your contributions and your thoughts today. It's been incredibly meaningful to me to have the opportunity to be in conversation with all three of our guests today.
Thank you.
So I'd also like to thank all of you, our audience, for joining us for this truly enlightening conversation this morning. I'd like to remind everyone that we're now going to take a 15-minute break, and that is until 10:30. Please take a moment to stretch and grab a coffee, and we'll resume at 10:30 with an address from the Honorable Lori Lightfoot, Mayor of Chicago. Thank you all very much.